Seattle existed on the thin seam between water and electricity, a city built where tide met current and neither ever fully won. Fog clung to glass towers like a second skin, dulling their edges, softening their height, making even steel appear hesitant. Streetlights bled into wet asphalt, stretching into broken reflections that looked like thoughts someone had tried and failed to suppress. The air carried salt from the bay, ozone from cables hidden beneath the streets, and the faint metallic scent of rain that never quite decided whether to fall or stay suspended. Liana Rowan moved through this landscape with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned early that attention was a liability. Her evenings followed a narrow corridor of routine. The university library until closing, the private clinic archive, where she sorted old files for extra hours, then the long walk toward transit with a backpack heavy enough to pull at her shoulders. Printed drafts of her thesis pressed against her spine, creased and annotated, evidence of a future she was trying to assemble piece by piece. She dressed plainly, walked quickly, and avoided reflective surfaces. In Seattle, that was usually enough. That night it was. At first, nothing announced itself as danger. There was no sudden noise, no hand at her wrist, no voice calling her name. It began instead with a subtle resistance in the air, as if the city had thickened by a fraction, enough for her body to notice before her mind did. Her steps slowed without instruction. Her breathing adjusted, shallow and measured, not from fear but from a vague sense of recalibration. She noticed the black SUV 2 lanes over only because it appeared again after a light change, then again after the next turn. The vehicle did not crowd her, did not accelerate or linger obviously. It occupied space with deliberate restraint, the way expensive things often did. Liana told herself she was exhausted. She distrusted intuition, considering it an indulgence people used when they didn't want to verify facts. She had spent years training herself to rely on structure, on data, on repeatable logic. Patterns without proof were just projections. She adjusted her route anyway. Instead of following the usual stretch toward the bus stop, she cut into a brighter block, then veered down a narrower street lined with offices already dark for the night. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with a low battery warning. Neon signage hummed overhead, reflected in shallow puddles like fractured symbols. She told herself she was saving time. She told herself she had done this before. The street ended sooner than expected. Where there should have been an open intersection, there was a construction barrier redirecting traffic, orange plastic glowing faintly under temporary lamps. The detour signage looked recent, almost too precise, as if installed with knowledge of exactly when it would be needed. Liana stopped, frowning, the sensation of density in the air returning, heavier now. She turned back, already planning an alternate path, when she saw the entrance to the underground parking structure across the street. He stood near the ramp, partially shielded by shadow, as if the architecture itself had been designed to frame him. Cal Renauer was not someone Liana knew personally, but she recognized him with the immediate certainty of a face absorbed through repetition. Screens had taught her his outlines. Financial news segments muted in break rooms, glossy profiles scrolling past while she waited for software updates, headlines she never clicked but could not entirely avoid. Chief executive, heir, survivor of a family that consumed itself quietly, expensively. In Seattle, his name circulated the way weather warnings did, acknowledged but rarely discussed in full. In person, he seemed less dramatic than the myth and more unsettling for it. He did not move to intercept her. He did not gesture or call out. He simply existed in her line of sight, hands relaxed, posture neutral, eyes directed toward nothing in particular until they were. His attention, when it settled on her, did so without urgency. It was the attention of someone accustomed to outcomes. Liana should have passed him, every rational impulse aligned toward that decision. She had no reason to stop, no connection to him, no invitation implied. Yet her body hesitated, not freezing but pausing, as if awaiting an instruction that never arrived. The sensation was not fear. Fear had a chemical edge, a sharpness she recognized. This was different. This was alignment, the uncomfortable sense of something clicking into place without her consent. For a fraction of a second, she considered that the city itself had shifted, that the routes she knew had rearranged themselves to funnel her here. The thought was irrational, and she dismissed it immediately. Cities did not conspire. People did. She resumed walking, passing him at a distance close enough to register details she hadn't expected to notice. The faint scent of rain on wool, the quiet precision of his stillness, the absence of any need to assert space. He did not turn to follow her. He did not reach out. Yet the moment she crossed the invisible line of his proximity, the pressure in the air eased, replaced by something hollow and unresolved. She continued down the block, heart steady, mind already cataloging the encounter as strange but irrelevant. She had learned to compartmentalize quickly. Survival demanded it. Still, as she reached the end of the street and merged back toward familiar territory, a subtle awareness lingered, the sense that an agreement had been acknowledged without being spoken. The rest of the walk passed without incident. The SUV did not reappear. The fog thickened, then thinned. The city resumed its usual indifference. By the time Liana reached her apartment building, she had almost convinced herself that fatigue had manufactured the entire experience. Almost. Inside her small room, the silence felt louder than it should have. She set her bag down carefully, aligning it against the desk leg, and moved through her nightly routine with deliberate slowness. Shoes off, jacket hung, phone plugged in. Each action grounded her, reaffirming the borders of her life. Yet beneath the familiarity, something had shifted, like a hairline fracture running under the surface of concrete. She washed her hands longer than necessary, watching water bead and slide over her skin. The reflection in the mirror looked unchanged. Same tired eyes, same pulled-back hair, same controlled posture. And still, a sense of exposure lingered, as if she had been seen in a way that bypassed appearances entirely. Liana lay awake longer than usual, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the soft mechanical sighs of the building settling. She replayed the night not as memory, but as data, searching for errors. There had been no direct threat, no exchange, no reason to assign meaning. And yet meaning pressed in regardless, subtle, and insistent. Somewhere in the city, systems were recalibrating. Decisions were aligning. She did not know it yet, but a contract had been acknowledged, not on paper, not in words, but in the quiet language of attention and proximity. The kind that did not require consent to become binding. When sleep finally came, it did not bring rest. It carried with it the muted certainty that the night had not ended when she closed her door, only paused. She woke into a silence that felt engineered. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, smooth and pale, cut by recessed lines where light should have been but wasn't. Illumination existed only as a muted presence, filtered and indirect, as if the house itself refused to acknowledge morning. The air carried a layered scent that did not belong to any place she knew. Polished wood warmed by hidden systems, cold metal untouched by humidity, and water drawn from somewhere deep and mineral-rich, stripped of softness. It was the smell of permanence, of decisions made long ago and maintained without sentiment. For several seconds she did not move. Her body lay still, not from calm but from calculation. Awareness came in fragments, assembling slowly, cautiously, as if her mind feared what coherence might reveal. Sensation arrived before memory. The weight of the sheets against her skin felt wrong, too smooth, too cool. Beneath that, deeper, her muscles held a residual tension, the echo of strain and release that did not yet have a narrative. Her first conscious breath caught halfway in. Liana shifted, just enough to feel it. the dull, internal ache low in her body, the unfamiliar sensitivity along her thighs, her hips, the back of her neck. Not pain exactly, but a changed topography, as though her body had been redrawn overnight. She swallowed and sat up slowly, the sheet sliding down to her waist. The movement made the sensations sharpen, align themselves into something undeniable. Memory did not follow. Instead, there were flashes without sequence. A ceiling darker than this one. Music that felt distant even as it vibrated through her chest. A hand at her lower back, not forceful, not gentle, simply inevitable. The pressure of another body, heat and weight, and the brief, tearing collision of pain and fire that had split her breath apart. The sense of falling inward while being held in place. The impression that she had both chosen and not chosen what came next. She pressed her palm to her sternum, grounding herself in the steady, controlled rhythm of her heart. Panic hovered nearby but did not breach her yet. Panic was loud and wasteful. This required precision. She scanned the room. It was large but not ostentatious. No excessive ornamentation, no art meant to impress. The space was defined by restraint. Walls paneled in dark wood that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A low table set at exact distance from the bed. Curtains partially drawn, allowing only a thin wash of gray daylight to bleed through. Nothing personal, nothing random. The room did not feel occupied so much as maintained. She looked down at herself. Her skin bore marks that were not bruises, not injuries, but impressions. The faint trace of fingers at her waist, pressure remembered rather than visible. A darker bloom at her inner thigh where sensitivity still flared. They did not feel violent. That realization unsettled her more than pain would have. There was no narrative of resistance to cling to, no clean line of violation. Only the uncomfortable truth of participation blurred by absence. She pushed the sheet aside completely and stood, legs unsteady but functional. The floor beneath her feet was heated, the warmth rising evenly, designed to be unnoticed. She moved with care, aware of her body in a way she never had been before, each step sending a reminder upward that something fundamental had shifted. Logic reasserted itself. Phone, clothing, location. Her phone was not on the bedside table. That absence tightened something in her chest. She scanned again and found it placed with careful consideration on the desk near the window, plugged in, screen dark but intact. She crossed the room and picked it up, fingers moving quickly, automatically. No missed calls, no messages, battery full, time displayed without comment. That steadiness, that lack of disruption, unnerved her more than chaos would have. She found her clothes folded neatly on a chair. Every item present. Nothing missing, nothing torn. The orderliness felt intentional, almost ceremonial, as if the night had been concluded properly even if she could not remember it. She dressed quickly, methodically, each layer restoring a degree of separation between her and the space around her. Only then did she look at the bed. The sheets were dark, high thread count fabric that disguised color well. Still, the evidence was there, unmistakable once seen. A faint, rust-colored stain near the center, already partially absorbed. The sight did not make her feel exposed or ashamed. It made her angry, not at an unseen man, not yet, but at herself. At the lapse, at the crack in discipline that had allowed this to happen without full awareness. She had guarded that part of herself not out of purity or fear, but control. It had been a boundary she maintained because it was hers to maintain. Seeing that boundary crossed without a clear memory of granting access ignited a cold, focused rage. She turned away before the feeling could spill into something less useful. The bathroom adjoined the room through a sliding door that opened silently at her touch. The surfaces inside mirrored the bedroom's aesthetic. Stone, glass, metal, all immaculate. The shower fixtures looked more like architecture than plumbing. She stepped inside and let the water run, testing temperature, pressure. It responded instantly, precisely, as if anticipating preference. As the water struck her skin, sensation overwhelmed thought. Her breath hitched again, muscles tightening reflexively. She braced one hand against the wall, eyes closed, grounding herself in the physical now. The water carried the same mineral scent as the room, cold at first, then warming smoothly. She scrubbed her skin harder than necessary, not to erase evidence but to reclaim ownership. The ache remained. She dressed and returned to the bedroom just as movement registered at the edge of her awareness. Not sound, exactly, but a shift in presence. The house announced nothing. It did not creak or whisper. It simply rearranged itself to accommodate the person entering. Cal Renauer appeared in the doorway without spectacle. He was fully dressed, immaculate, as if the night had passed without touching him. His expression was neutral, composed, eyes clear and assessing without visible intrusion. He did not look at her body first. He looked at her face as if confirming something. The absence of urgency in him was disorienting. There was no apology, no tension, no performative concern. His calm settled over the room like a weight, heavier than anger would have been. He carried himself as someone for whom outcomes had already resolved themselves. He acknowledged the facts without dramatization. That she was safe. That there was no risk, no medical concern. That what had happened could not be undone and therefore did not require justification. The framing was clinical, almost respectful and entirely devoid of softness. He did not minimize the impact. He simply placed it beyond revision. Liana listened without interrupting, jaw tight, fingers curled at her sides. She felt the instinct to push back, to reject his framing, to call it a mistake and reduce it to a lapse of judgment. She did exactly that, nomming it an error, something to be sealed away, forgotten, never repeated. She demanded discretion, silence, erasure. What unsettled her most was not his reaction, but the absence of surprise. When she turned to leave, he did not step into her path. He did not reach for her or raise his voice. He let her go with the same deliberate control that marked every other aspect of the space. It was the allowance that chilled her, the sense that departure had been accounted for, not resisted. As she crossed the threshold, she felt it again, that subtle recalibration in the air, as if her movement had triggered a larger adjustment elsewhere. She did not look back. She refused to grant the moment any additional power through acknowledgement. The drive home blurred at the edges. The city outside the windows looked unchanged, yet she moved through it differently, hyper-aware, as though every reflection might carry a trace of the night she could not access. Her body remembered even as her mind resisted. By the time she reached her apartment, exhaustion pressed in from all sides. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing slowly, counting. The space felt smaller than it had the night before, more fragile. She knew, with a clarity that bypassed emotion, that her leaving had not ended anything. It had defined something instead. Not a bond, not an agreement, but an interest sharpened by resistance. She had not exited a closed door. She had stepped into a corridor she could not yet see. Somewhere behind her, beyond walls and distance, Cal Renauer had watched her go not with loss, but with attention. And attention, she would come to understand, was never neutral. The University of Washington campus looked harmless in daylight, a carefully maintained illusion of openness and safety. Brick buildings framed wide paths where students moved in loose currents, carrying coffee cups and laptops, voices overlapping into a constant, low hum. Trees filtered the light, softening edges, making the place feel insulated from the rest of the city. It was easy to believe that nothing truly dangerous could take root here, that the world's harsher mechanisms stopped at the perimeter marked by banners and plaques. At night, the truth surfaced. After sunset, the campus transformed into something colder and more precise. Glass facades turned reflective, returning distorted images of anyone who passed too close. Footsteps echoed too clearly between buildings, stripped of the cover that crowds provided. Every movement felt observed, multiplied by reflections in windows and darkened lecture halls. The familiar routes Liana had walked for years now felt like corridors of exposure, places where it was impossible to tell whether she was alone or simply unaccompanied. She tried to reassemble normality through routine. Morning lectures, afternoon shifts at the clinic archive, evenings reserved for her thesis. She adhered to schedules with near-military discipline, filling every hour with purpose so there would be no space left for memory. If she kept moving, if she treated her life as a system that could be stabilized through consistency, the fracture might seal itself. It didn't. Her body betrayed her first. Sleep came shallow and fragmented, punctured by sensations that arrived without images. A tightening low in her abdomen, a sudden awareness of her back, her throat, the vulnerable geometry of her own posture. She woke more than once with the sense that someone had been standing just outside her door, only to find the hallway empty and silent. On campus, she began to notice patterns that resisted dismissal. A black sedan parked too often near the same building. A man in a neutral coat who appeared in her peripheral vision, then vanished when she turned her head. Her phone's signal dropping in specific pockets of space, only to return seconds later as if nothing had happened. None of it was provable. All of it was cumulative. She told herself that hypervigilance was a normal response to stress. That trauma rewired perception. That assigning intention to coincidence was a failure of discipline. Still, she adjusted her routes, changed her schedules, avoided empty buildings after dark. Invisibility had always been her shield. Now it felt perforated. The second blow came without warning and without spectacle. She returned to her apartment earlier than expected one afternoon, intent on retrieving a book she had forgotten. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air carried a scent that did not belong to her, unfamiliar soap, another body's warmth. The sound reached her before the sight of it, a muted laugh abruptly cut short. She stood still, hand on the doorframe, and let the scene resolve itself without emotion. Her boyfriend and her roommate did not look surprised. That detail lodged deeper than shock would have. There was no panic, no scrambling for excuses. Only the awkward stillness of people caught not in a mistake, but in an arrangement they had already justified to themselves. Liana did not raise her voice. She did not cry or accuse or demand explanations. The cold, analytical part of her mind took over immediately, isolating variables, identifying outcomes. She closed the door. She went to her room. She packed only what she needed, movements efficient, almost mechanical. She avoided reflective surfaces, avoided looking at either of them again. When she walked out, she did so without ceremony, as if this, too, were simply another system that had failed and required abandonment. Only once she was outside did the impact land. Not grief, not heartbreak, displacement. The realization that every structure she had relied on was collapsing in sequence. First, her sense of bodily autonomy, fractured by a night she could not fully access. Now her home, rendered hostile by betrayal that had clearly predated her discovery. It felt less like coincidence than orchestration, as if something unseen was methodically removing her supports one by one. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag at her feet, the city pressing in from all sides, and felt something close to vertigo. For the first time, panic breached the perimeter she had built around herself. Her thoughts scattered, searching for exits, for any space that wasn't contaminated by memory or exposure. That was when the car stopped beside her. It did not announce itself with a horn or sudden movement. It simply aligned with her position, matching the curb as if guided there by the road itself. The door unlocked with a sound so soft it was almost polite. The presence inside the vehicle was unmistakable even before she looked. Cal Renauer did not ask questions. He did not scan her face for emotion or attempt to interpret her silence. He acknowledged her state without comment, as though it had been anticipated. The offer implicit in his stillness was not comfort but containment, a temporary reduction of variables. A shelter defined not by warmth, but by control. She refused automatically, the word leaving her mouth before she had fully decided. Refusal was her last remaining boundary, and she clung to it with instinctive force. But the street around her felt suddenly unsafe in a way it hadn't moments before. Her apartment was no longer an option. Friends felt distant, compromised by proximity to the same social circles that had already failed her. The city offered movement, but no direction. The fire was too close. She entered the car with the awareness of someone choosing between two dangers and selecting the one she could see. The interior sealed itself around her with engineered subtlety. The door closed without weight. The windows dimmed slightly, mooting the outside world. The driver did not turn, did not speak, did not react in any visible way. The car pulled away smoothly, as if the decision had been finalized long before she made it. As they moved through the city, Liana cataloged details compulsively. The way the driver avoided certain streets, the absence of abrupt stops, the faint pressure change in her ears as if the vehicle maintained its own atmosphere. Her phone, still in her hand, displayed inconsistent signal strength, fluctuating without pattern. It unsettled her more than total loss would have. And yet, beneath the vigilance, there was an undeniable calm. The chaos that had been threatening to tear her open receded slightly, held at bay by the sheer certainty of the space she now occupied. Cal's presence did not soothe her, but it stabilized her. Like a wall erected between her and the elements, indifferent to whether she appreciated its existence. She did not look at him directly. She did not trust herself to read what she might find there. Instead, she watched the city slide past the tinted glass, reflections blurring into abstract motion. The sense of being carried rather than moving herself was both relieving and deeply unsettling. Later that day, information surfaced with cruel efficiency. A conversation overheard at the clinic archive hinted at corporate pressure affecting funding streams. A familiar surname surfaced in a context that made her stomach tighten. Her biological father, a connection she rarely acknowledged, was linked to one of Renauer Systems' primary competitors. The realization landed with sharp clarity. Her academic work, her access to sensitive records, her very existence intersected lines of influence she had never intended to approach. The night with Cal Renauer lost its remaining ambiguity. It was no longer a private lapse, no longer an isolated rupture in her personal life. It was a point of contact, a variable introduced into a conflict far larger and far older than her. The betrayal at home, the surveillance she could not prove, the sudden appearance of shelter offered by the one man positioned at the center of it all, it formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. As evening settled over campus again, Liana understood that she was no longer merely reacting to events. She had been placed, observed, evaluated. The shadows between buildings seemed thicker now, charged with meaning. Every reflective surface felt like a potential witness. She had not chosen the war she had stepped into. But the war had chosen her. The house did not wait for agreement. From the moment Liana stepped onto the property, it behaved as if her presence had already been accounted for. The drive curved through dense trees that filtered the city out of existence, replacing noise with a controlled hush. The structure revealed itself gradually, not as a sudden display of wealth, but as a mass embedded into the terrain, stone and glass aligned with the slope as though the land had been persuaded to accept it. There were no ornamental gates, no visible guards. Security existed, but it did not announce itself. It assumed compliance. Cal Renauer never framed the arrangement as a request. He presented it as a solution, already balanced, already justified. Her vulnerabilities were listed implicitly rather than named. The compromised apartment, the unstable academic environment, the growing visibility of her name in places it did not belong. Against those variables, the proposal appeared clean and efficient. Temporary residence, defined responsibilities, generous compensation. Transportation handled without inconvenience. The language of logistics stripped the situation of sentiment, turning displacement into an operational adjustment. Liana recognized the structure immediately. This was not employment, it was placement. She felt it in the way the timeline was suggested rather than discussed, in how contingencies had already been anticipated. The rationale centered on Cal's younger brother and the upcoming entrance examinations, a narrative that sounded plausible enough to pass scrutiny. Her academic profile fit neatly. Her background created symmetry. Nothing about it required force. It relied instead on the absence of alternatives. She told herself it was temporary, that the clarity of boundaries would protect her, that she would define the terms by adhering strictly to function. The belief felt thin even as she held on to it, but logic demanded movement, not stagnation. Remaining exposed in a collapsing environment was not an option. She agreed not because she trusted the offer, but because refusal no longer presented a safer path. The house accepted her, without ceremony. Inside, space unfolded with deliberate restraint. Corridors widened or narrowed in subtle increments, guiding movement without overt instruction. Light behaved selectively, pooling where it encouraged stillness, receding where it discouraged lingering. Surfaces absorbed sound, moving footsteps until motion felt disembodied. The effect was disorienting, not through excess but through absence. There was nothing to anchor herself to emotionally. No warmth to soften the edges, only function. Cameras were not visible, yet their presence was undeniable. She sensed them the way one senses pressure changes, not through sight but through instinctive adjustment. The architecture itself seemed to watch, angles aligned too precisely, reflections positioned where they would catch motion without drawing attention. The staff moved through the space with minimal speech, expressions neutral, actions efficient. They did not ignore her, but neither did they engage. Their awareness of her was professional, calibrated, as though they had been briefed on her relevance without being told her story. Her room was on the first floor. The placement struck her immediately. Accessible, observable, close enough to central areas to remain within the house's rhythm, distant enough to maintain a controlled perimeter. The room itself mirrored the rest of the structure. Clean lines, muted tones, no personal markers. It felt less like a bedroom and more like a designated zone. The window overlooked a portion of the grounds that appeared natural until studied closely, landscaping shaped to look organic while obeying strict geometric logic. The route from her room to the kitchen revealed itself quickly, not because she was shown, but because the house subtly discouraged alternatives. Hallways curved away from peripheral areas. Doors remained closed without appearing locked. The main path was illuminated at consistent intervals, guiding her forward with quiet insistence. By the third traversal, she could have walked it blindfolded. The realization unsettled her. Her presence altered the internal atmosphere in ways that were difficult to articulate. Some members of the staff grew more cautious, their movements slowing slightly when she entered a space. Others became distant, eyes sliding past her as if acknowledging her directly would carry consequence. A few watched her openly, expressions unreadable, assessing. She understood then that she was not neutral here. She was a variable. Cal's inner circle revealed itself gradually. Advisors who spoke in lowered tones, their conversations halting when she approached. Assistants whose attention flickered between her and Cal with calculated neutrality. And one woman, familiar without context, whose smile never reached her eyes. The woman's composure was immaculate, her interest in Liana measured, as though she were evaluating an object whose value was not yet fixed. the tension between them did not manifest as hostility. It lingered instead as an unspoken hierarchy, a reminder that proximity to power was not evenly distributed. Liana's analytical mind worked constantly, cataloging behavior, mapping relationships, searching for inconsistencies. She treated the house as a system to be understood, believing that comprehension would grant control. During the day, this strategy functioned. Facts aligned. Patterns emerged. The younger brother's study schedule adhered to precision. Cal's movements through the house followed predictable arcs. The environment responded reliably to presence and absence. Night dismantled that illusion. After dark, the house changed character. The silence deepened, no longer neutral but weighted, as if filled with unexpressed intent. Sounds traveled unpredictably. A faint shift in the corridor outside her room could be nothing or something else entirely. Glass vibrated subtly, not from wind but from pressure she could not locate. Once, she woke convinced that someone had paused outside her door, only to find the hallway empty when she opened it. She began to sense a presence that did not resolve into form. Not a figure, not a voice, but an awareness threaded through the structure itself. The feeling was ancient rather than threatening, as though the house remembered things she did not. The thought disturbed her more than fear would have. She had always believed places were passive. This one felt participatory. Cal moved through this environment as though it were an extension of his body. Doors opened before he reached them. Lighting adjusted to his pace. Conversations shifted when he entered a room, not out of deference but anticipation. He did not command the house. He synchronized with it. Observing this, Liana understood that the control he exercised was not enforced moment by moment. It had been embedded long ago. Despite her resolve to maintain distance, proximity eroded her defenses. Not through overt pressure, but through constant exposure. Shared spaces, overlapping schedules. His attention was not intrusive, but it was precise. He noticed deviations, changes in her routine, fluctuations in her focus. When he looked at her, it felt less like observation and more like measurement, as if he were tracking her adjustment to an environment designed to test endurance. She began to question where choice ended and influence began. The longer she stayed, the more she sensed that decisions were being made around her rather than with her. Small things at first, adjustments to her schedule that appeared convenient, information that reached her without explanation, obstacles that dissolved before she encountered them. The house facilitated outcomes smoothly, removing friction she had not requested. Each convenience carried a subtle cost, reliance. At night, the sensation beneath the surface intensified. The house settled into itself with a soundless certainty, walls holding something unspoken. Liana lay awake, listening to the absence of noise, feeling watched without eyes. She could not name it as supernatural, not definitively. There were no manifestations, no breaches of physical law. Only the persistent impression that the space was older than it should have been, layered with intent accumulated over time. She wondered how many others had lived here under similar terms. How many had mistaken structure for safety? How many had adjusted themselves to fit the contours of a place that did not adapt in return? By the end of the first week, she understood that the house did not merely shelter its occupants. It shaped them. It anticipated needs, redirected impulses, narrowed options until choices aligned with its internal logic. Cal did not need to ask for compliance. The environment produced it. Liana remained outwardly composed, fulfilling her role with precision. But beneath that discipline, a sharper awareness took root. She was not simply residing in a controlled space. She was inside a mechanism that optimized outcomes according to rules she had not written. And the house, in its quiet, unwavering way, had already decided that she belonged within its system. Pressure did not arrive with a single event that could be named and set aside. It accumulated like humidity in an enclosed room, unnoticed until breathing required effort. Liana felt it in the way her days began to lose their familiar edges, in the way her choices stopped behaving like choices and started behaving like the narrowest remaining route between two walls. From the outside, nothing about her life looked dramatic. She still attended lectures. She still submitted drafts. She still showed up at the clinic archive when scheduled, sleeves rolled to her forearms, hair tied back, hands steady as she sorted paper and scanned barcodes into systems that pretended to be neutral. The outward continuity almost convinced her that the fracture was contained, but the internal logic of her world had shifted. Cause and effect no longer matched. Outcomes arrived too quickly, too cleanly, as if someone had removed the friction that usually made life feel real. Her former boyfriend's decline began with small losses that carried no headline. A promised interview was rescheduled twice, and then replaced with an impersonal rejection. A teaching assistantship he had been confident about went to someone else without explanation. An academic advisor who had always replied within hours became unreachable, then suddenly unavailable this quarter. These were ordinary things, the kind that happened to people every day. Liana understood that the very ordinariness was the point. If she accused anyone, she would sound paranoid. If she tried to trace the chain of decisions, she would find only procedural reasons and polite refusals. Still, the pattern had a shape. The setbacks arrived in a sequence that felt instructive, as though the universe had adopted a new author. He did not fall apart in public. He simply lost traction. His confidence frayed. His social posture changed. He became cautious in the way people become cautious after realizing that invisible consequences can be worse than visible ones. Liana watched from a distance, her mind cataloging what she could not prove. She felt no satisfaction. The knowledge that someone could dismantle a person's trajectory without leaving fingerprints was not comforting. It was a warning delivered in a language she understood. Her former roommate disappeared from the campus atmosphere even faster. There were no confrontations, no dramatic exile. It was as if the social field around her had been quietly drained. Invitations stopped. Study groups reformed without her. Parties happened and she wasn't included in the photos. She remained physically present in the same buildings, the same cafeterias, the same hallways, yet her relevance evaporated. People who once greeted her looked away, not out of loyalty to Liana's pain, but out of self-preservation. Proximity to the wrong person could become expensive. Everyone sensed it, even if no one said it. The most disturbing part was how quickly the campus accepted the new hierarchy. The university was supposed to be a place of principles. In practice, it was an ecosystem. Money moved through it like blood. Influence followed money, and fear followed influence. Liana saw it in the way administrators spoke more carefully when the Renauer name hovered near a conversation, even unspoken. She saw it in the way career counselors suddenly mentioned private pipelines and strategic placements with a tone that disguised hunger as professionalism. She saw it in the way professors softened when discussing opportunities tied to external funding, how they framed access as merit while quietly acknowledging that merit was not the only currency. Whispers began to circulate about grants, internships, research opportunities that seemed to appear and vanish depending on a shadowed endorsement. No one openly attributed these fluctuations to Cal Renauer, but the implication was everywhere. A scholar with the right connections suddenly had a new lab slot. A student with the wrong proximity suddenly had a closed door. The campus did not need a visible rule to enforce obedience. It only needed a rumor with weight behind it. Liana responded by doing what she had always done, tightening her control. She compressed her schedule until it was dense enough to resist intrusion. She moved through the house with deliberate efficiency, limiting herself to the necessary routes, avoiding lingering in shared spaces. She kept tutoring sessions with Cal's younger brother strictly professional, her voice neutral, her posture disciplined, her gaze focused on textbooks rather than faces. She treated the arrangement as a contract in the purest sense, believing that formality could protect her. The house did not punish her for this. It simply adapted around her. Cal never demanded attention. He did not storm into her spaces or corner her with obvious force. His strategy was subtler, and for that reason, more destabilizing. He began to occupy the edges of her routine as if he were testing how much pressure her boundaries could hold before they flexed. She would turn a corridor and find him in a doorway she needed to pass. She would enter the kitchen to pour water and sense him behind her before she heard movement. Sometimes he was there for seconds only, present long enough to alter the air, then gone, leaving the space to feel emptier than it had before. He used pauses the way others used touch. A glance held fractionally too long, a silence that extended just beyond comfort, a measured absence that followed, forcing her to carry the weight of what had not been said. There was no warmth in it, no attempt to charm her with soft words or perform concern. The absence of performance made the attention more potent. It felt like being studied by someone who did not need to persuade, only to observe how she reacted under controlled conditions. Her body reacted before her mind allowed interpretation. That was the cruelty of it. She could discipline her thoughts, but sensation bypassed discipline. She remembered him not as a storyline but as pressure and heat, as the way her spine had responded to a hand at her lower back, the way her throat tightened when the air shifted near her neck. Memory arrived in her muscles without images, stripped of romance, stripped of softness. It was purely physical, and therefore difficult to debate. She hated herself for it. Not because she believed desire was shameful, but because desire made her predictable. She had built her life on being unreadable, on guarding her inner currents behind competence and restraint. Now her body threatened to reveal her to herself, and the possibility that Cal could sense those changes made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. Sometimes he responded to her before she acted. She noticed it in small moments that should have been meaningless. Her irritation rising slightly at a logistical inconvenience, and Cal's presence shifting into her path as if he had anticipated her attempt to regain control. Her fatigue sharpening into impatience, and a minor obstacle dissolving before she had time to address it. Her resolve hardening into refusal, and Cal's attention withdrawing, leaving her to confront the emptiness of a space that suddenly felt too quiet. It did not feel like mind reading. It felt like attunement. That idea unsettled her enough that she tried to disprove it. She tracked variables. She tested her own perceptions, forcing herself to attribute his timing to surveillance, to staff updates, to routine coincidence. But the impression persisted. The way Cal moved through the house and through her life carried the ease of someone responding to signals beneath language. She began to notice other inconsistencies, too. Cal's knowledge of people's histories arrived too cleanly. He understood personal weaknesses that were not public, fractures that were not documented. He predicted reactions with unsettling accuracy. When a minor threat surfaced around the house, it was neutralized without escalation, as if a system had been waiting for that specific problem. The staff did not panic. They adjusted. Security did not appear. The threat simply stopped existing. Liana never saw the mechanism, only the result. In Seattle itself, rumors gained texture when she listened long enough. She heard them in the clinic's back hallways, in half-spoken jokes between nurses, in late-night conversations overheard at the university when someone thought she was out of range. Stories of families that stayed powerful across generations without visible succession. Stories of executives whose faces didn't change the way time should have changed them. Stories of agreements sealed in ways that didn't show up in paperwork. People framed these stories as urban myth, a way to romanticize old money and old violence. But the people telling them often looked over their shoulder afterward, as if the myth could hear them. Liana kept her expression neutral, and stored the information away. Speculation was not proof, yet the accumulation of speculation began to feel like a map of something hidden under the city's skin. Her breaking point did not arrive during a confrontation. It arrived during routine. One evening, while organizing materials in a restricted section of the house's internal archive, she accessed a system she had not realized she could enter. The access happened smoothly, without warnings or delays, as if the system recognized her before she recognized it. The interface displayed folders labeled with neutral administrative terms. She expected schedules, invoices, ordinary household documentation. Instead, she saw dates that made her stomach turn. Entries that predated their first encounter. A calendar segment that mirrored her movements with unnerving precision. A time stamp aligned with her departure from the clinic weeks before she had noticed the black SUV. A still image pulled from a security feed she did not recognize, showing her profile in motion, unaware of the lens. The resolution was high, the framing deliberate. She looked like a subject, not a passerby. It was not proof in the legal sense. It was not a signed confession. It was implication sharpened into near certainty. Her anger rose instantly, not hot and chaotic, but clean. It cut through doubt and fatigue, replacing them with clarity. The night she could not fully recall no longer felt like a random accident. It felt like a convergence engineered with patience. The house had not merely accepted her, it had been prepared for her. Her choice had been shaped long before she understood she was being shaped. She did not panic. She did not destroy anything. She closed the file carefully and restored the interface to its prior state, aware that any sudden action would be recorded and interpreted. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained controlled. The discipline that had kept her functional through loss now became something else, a weapon. When she left the archive, the corridors felt different. Not louder, not darker, but alert. The house seemed to hold its silence more tightly, as if responding to a change in the variable it had been studying. Liana sensed, without seeing, that a tension had sharpened around her. She had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer merely an occupant moving through a system. She was a consciousness inside it that had begun to understand its design. Her anger made her dangerous, not because it would push her into reckless rebellion, but because it made her precise. She began mapping what she could, not with dramatic gestures, but with controlled observation. She tracked how information moved through the staff. She noted which doors were always closed and which opened on certain patterns of presence. She watched how Cal's advisors adjusted their behavior when she entered a room. She listened for names, for timings, for the subtle shifts that revealed allegiance. She treated each detail as data, each pause as a signal. The attraction did not vanish. It remained, a low gravitational pull that complicated her resistance. She could not deny that his presence stabilized parts of her that felt close to collapse. She could not deny that her body recognized him. But now the pull existed alongside something sharper. The understanding that attraction was one of his tools, woven into the same structure as pressure, convenience, and deniable consequences. By the end of the night, she understood that Cal's world did not separate tenderness from control. It blended them until it was difficult to tell which one she was responding to. He had created an environment in which her refusals became part of the calibration, in which every boundary she defended was measured and remembered. And now, because she had seen the outline of the machinery beneath her life, she could no longer pretend she was simply enduring it. She had entered the phase where observation turned reciprocal, where the subject began studying the architect. The threshold announced itself without sound. Liana felt it before she understood it, a shift in the internal pressure that had governed her days since entering Cal Renauer's orbit. The house remained unchanged, its systems humming with the same quiet precision, its corridors still absorbing light and sound as designed. Yet something in the arrangement of events had tightened, drawing lines that could no longer be ignored. The external conflict she had sensed in fragments now resolved into a structure sharp enough to cut. Information surfaced with the same efficiency that had characterized every other transition in her life since the night she lost her invisibility. Corporate filings, delayed mergers, sudden legal pressure applied in jurisdictions chosen for their inconvenience rather than their relevance. The names involved were not abstract. They belonged to a family she had learned to keep at arm's length, a biological connection she acknowledged only when necessary. Her father's world intersected directly with Renauer Systems, not as a distant competitor, but as a pressure point. Contracts stalled. Partners withdrew. The corporate war revealed itself not as a clash of entities, but as a contest of leverage. And she was leverage. The realization did not shock her. It settled instead with the quiet finality of a truth that had been circling for weeks. Her presence in Cal's house had never been incidental. It had been positioned. Her access, her visibility, her history had aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. She was not a pawn in the traditional sense. Pawns were expendable. She was something else. A bridge, a fault line, a way to apply force without appearing to touch the target. A family member reached out, urgency stripped of subtlety. The warning came layered with concern and guilt, a recognition that protection had arrived too late. Cal Renauer was named directly, no longer shrouded in implication. Dangerous, untouchable, a man whose power extended beyond contracts and capital. The plea carried the desperation of someone who believed escape was still possible if action was immediate. Liana listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. The warning did not alter her understanding. It merely confirmed what she had already deduced. The danger was real, but it was not new. It had been present from the moment the black SUV aligned itself with her path. To leave now would not erase her involvement. It would only remove her agency within it. She saw herself clearly then, not through fear or attraction, but through function. For Cal, she was not a curiosity to be indulged or discarded. She was a variable with potential yield, an intersection of vulnerabilities that could be exploited without triggering open retaliation. At the same time, there was restraint in how he handled her that did not align with pure strategy. He did not push her to the breaking point. He did not isolate her entirely. He allowed resistance, even seemed to study it. That contradiction unsettled her more than open cruelty would have. It meant there was something in her he did not want to destroy. Desire, she realized, was his liability. Not the desire of romance or possession in the ordinary sense, but a focused interest that disrupted his otherwise ruthless efficiency. Cal Renauer did not tolerate weakness, especially in himself. The fact that he accommodated her resistance, adjusted rather than crushed, suggested a fracture in his control. That fracture was narrow, but it existed. Seattle absorbed the rain that night without protest. Water slid down glass and steel, blurring the city into layers of reflection and shadow. The streets gleamed as if polished, every surface catching light and distorting it. Liana moved through the city with deliberate calm, her awareness expanded rather than overwhelmed. The rain felt like part of the architecture, a constant presence that erased footprints even as it revealed contours. She stopped reacting. Instead, she began assembling her position. She traced the edges of observation, identifying where surveillance softened and where it sharpened. She cataloged the patterns of attention around her, the moments when staff adjusted before she spoke, the subtle shifts in behavior that indicated allegiance beyond employment. She separated what could be explained by fear from what could not. The difference mattered. Fear produced hesitation. Something else produced obedience. Her focus turned inward as much as outward. She examined her attraction to Cal with the same discipline she applied to data. She refused to romanticize it. She acknowledged the physiological responses without assigning them meaning. Attraction, she understood, did not require trust. It did not require safety. It simply existed, and like any force, it could be measured and managed. She began asking different questions, not how to escape, but how the system sustained itself, where the line lay between human authority and something older, more ingrained. The rumors she had dismissed earlier took on new context. Families that did not age as expected, power that persisted beyond legal cycles, deals sealed through ritualized behavior rather than documentation. She did not leap to conclusions. She followed patterns. The supernatural did not reveal itself with spectacle. It surfaced in precision. She noticed it in the way certain individuals around Cal moved with ritual consistency, gestures repeated with near-identical timing. In the way some eyes held a depth that felt unmoored from the present, as though anchored to a longer memory. Fear alone could not explain that. Neither could loyalty. It felt conditioned, ingrained, as if obedience had been rehearsed across generations. One night, her attention caught on a detail she could not dismiss. A mark on Cal's wrist, visible only briefly when the light struck at the right angle. It did not resemble any contemporary tattoo. There was no ink gradient, no evidence of modern technique. It looked embedded rather than applied, a symbol whose geometry resisted immediate interpretation. It was subtle enough to escape notice, deliberate enough to carry meaning. Not a display, a signature. The realization deepened her understanding rather than frightening her. Cal was not performing power. He was inheriting it. Whatever structure sustained him extended beyond his lifetime, beyond corporate influence. He was a current bearer, not the source. Her world expanded in response. She no longer framed herself as an outsider trapped within a hostile system. She was inside a living architecture of influence that spanned time as well as space. To flee would be to remain ignorant. To stay was to learn the rules that had never been written down. The threshold became visible then, not as a physical boundary, but as a state of decision. She stood between two outcomes that would define her trajectory irreversibly. Escape offered the illusion of safety, but guaranteed perpetual reaction. Acceptance promised danger, but allowed for agency. She chose neither submission nor rebellion. She chose presence. Liana remained in the house not as a protected asset or a tolerated liability, but as an observing intelligence. She accepted that Cal's shadow would not recede simply because she wished it. Instead, she began constructing her own shadow, one shaped by knowledge rather than fear. She studied the intersections of power, the quiet rituals that sustained obedience, the fractures where desire undermined control. She did not confront Cal. She did not declare independence or demand transparency. Those were gestures of people who believed power responded to language. She understood better now. Power responded to leverage, to timing, to comprehension. The rain continued to fall, erasing the city even as it revealed its underlying structure. Liana stood at the window of the house that had already decided she belonged within its system. She did not feel trapped. She felt alert. The story did not end with resolution. It ended with alignment. She remained at the threshold, fully aware that crossing it back would not return her to who she had been. She stayed not because she was owned, but because she had begun to understand the price of ownership and the value of standing close enough to measure it. In the shadow of a man who had built his life on control, she began the slow, deliberate work of building her own. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.